Okay, well, I guess that's on. Let me call this to order. Before I welcome our Dean Scott Gronert up to welcome all of you, I wanted first to begin by acknowledging that in Milwaukee, we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shore of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet and the human and non-human people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Now to welcome us all here and to kick off this conference, I'd like to invite Scott Gronert to come up. Scott.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here. And first of all, I'd like to welcome you to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. It's a very special place. We do something interesting here. We are an institution that sits in an urban setting. We invite students from all backgrounds, many of them first-generation students, and then we invite them to interact with a world-class faculty that's doing outstanding research, and we harvest the good things that comes out of that combination. The College of Letters and Science sits in the middle of it, and we're blessed to have the Center for 21st Century Studies in the college. Looking at the center, turbulent times can produce wonderful things, and that's how the center was produced. In 1968, the Center for 20th Century Studies emerged. If you look across the country, a lot of very important research centers came to being in 1968. The center is over 50 years. It survived the transition from Center for 20th Century Studies to Center for 21st Century Studies, and it's thriving right now under the leadership of Richard Grusin and Maureen Ryan. I was just looking a little bit back at the history. A comment in the time when it was being formed, this came from the dean at the time of the College of Letters and Science. It's to be an instrument that will eventually assist humanistically oriented faculty despite the division or the department for which they come. So that's 1968, and people were thinking about interdisciplinarity then. And I think that's a key to this center, is that the faculty own it, and it's not the faculty of a department or division, it's the faculty who are humanists. Another comment about the humanities, this is a quote: "The relevance of the humanities is greater today than ever before." And that's a quote you'd expect from the dean of the College of Letters and Science. That's actually a quote from the president of the University of Wisconsin system just this year, Ray Cross. And it warmed my heart, being a dean of a College of Letters and Science, the president of our system is valuing the humanities in that way. Today, we're looking at how the humanities makes a connection between how we live and the most pressing of the world's problems. Places like C21 are incubators for today's critical thinkers. The title today, Insecurity, sums it all up, really. You know, what is the human impact of this rapidly changing world, and the way that we deal with financial changes or threats to our financial markets, world order changes, climate changes, all of those. We have an incredible ability to measure things, to create data, to catalog data, but to understand it is just what we're doing here today. So you're going to be treated to an outstanding program, and thanks so much for bringing it to UWM. And I'll stop there and turn the podium back to Richard.
Okay, I have new glasses, which I had to get in a hurry because my daughter accidentally gave my glasses away to Salvation Army when we were clearing some things out of the house. And those were continuous focal, lenses which I could read with, and I had to get these in a hurry, and the only thing they could do was to give me distance lenses. So I'm in the unusual position, maybe some of you do this already, of having to take my glasses off to read. So, okay. We live today in an age of insecurity. Our economic situations are increasingly precarious. Job security, benefits, and a retirement plan are now the exception rather than the rule, largely a relic of the long 20th century, if not also its intensification. Traditional sites of refuge and comfort, mosques, synagogues, and churches, elementary and high schools, college and university campuses, stores, stadia and arenas, and workplaces have become vulnerable and newly fortified against acts of violence and terror. Our daily interactions with print, televisual, and socially networked news media heighten the mood, Stimmung, or structure of feeling of insecurity by incessantly remediating stories of global climate change, government corruption, national and transnational border crises, threats of terrorism, or racialized police violence. But insecurity is not only something that we feel, think, and embody on an individual or collective level. Insecurity is structural, or perhaps infrastructural as well, built into the unequal distribution of wealth, increasingly fragile democratic institutions, and the global regime of near-total surveillance. Economic systems, climate systems, defense systems, data systems, all are designed with security and thereby insecurity in mind. This conference has been put together to explore the concept of insecurity as one of the governing logics of economic, political, and social life in the West at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Insecurity picks up on and challenges several key concepts of 21st century studies, especially precarity, securitization, and resilience. As I understand it, the notion of insecurity has affinities with, but is more capacious than, precarity, which has been used by cultural, economic, and socio-political theorists to describe the structural vulnerability that runs through the complex historical formation of precarious labor under which we operate today. Like precarity, insecurity manifests itself in terms of diminished access to housing, food, healthcare, and other vital human and social welfare resources. Both precarity and insecurity address the increasing economic inequality of the 21st century, in which the gap between individual and corporate wealth and the income of those who work or are unable to work for a living grows increasingly vast and unbridgeable. Our definition of insecurity begins with and is predicated upon the structural economic injustice that predominates in our present historical moment, but expands the concept of precarity from its primarily economic meaning to include affective, ecological, and geopolitical concerns. Insecurity also picks up on and challenges the basic premises of securitization, which refers to the burgeoning structure of state and non-state surveillance that has proliferated in the US and globally after 9/11. In fact, it would not be mistaken to insist that rather than making populations, transportation, and information systems more secure, securitization systematically produces insecurity, evident most dramatically in the treatment of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers across the globe, but also in the increased danger of cyber crimes or cyber war, terrorism, climate disasters, global epidemics, and economic crashes. Political theorists and legal scholars have identified the insecurity state, which gets at some of what our speakers will address over the next couple of days. Others will take up the way in which surveillance and securitization generate both individual and collective feelings of insecurity. These are experienced in a highly securitized daily life, in which the ubiquity of social media, data mining, GPS tracking, and other surveillance technologies enables the collection of unfathomable quantities of data in the name of securing the state from both named and unnamed threats, which are themselves produced by the apparatus of securitization. Still other speakers today will explore how cultural and aesthetic forms and artifacts reflect, generate, and critique the insecurity of life in the 21st century. We also intended the concept of insecurity to challenge the broadly transdisciplinary concept of resilience, which has emerged over the past decades as a successor to ideas of stability and sustainability. Resilience is usually seen as an attribute of systems and can be found wherever system-based thinking obtains. Resilience begins from the notion that shock, crisis, and trauma are not exceptional states, but rather the condition of individual and collective existence under capitalism. The unstable economic cycle of bubbles and crashes, like the unstable alternation of geopolitical state formations between authoritarian and participatory forms of governance, have proved favorable for the concentration of wealth and power among a ruling elite across the globe. Such shocks and crises test the system to see if it is resilient enough to survive their inevitable disruption. They work as physical shocks that impact humans and non-humans as actants in the world. Rather than strive for stable and sustainable structures, political, technical, and economic advocates of resilience aim to produce physical, social, and psychological systems that will be able to bounce back from their vulnerability to the shocks, crises, or traumas that they believe will invariably befall both individuals and collectives. Resilience operates in a multiplicity of spheres. Insecurity is its unspoken counterpart. It's because systems are inevitably vulnerable and subject to periodic crises, shocks, traumas, and breakdowns that they're built to be resilient in the first place. Like securitization, then, resilience generates insecurity rather than eliminates it. By focusing on insecurity, we hope to shine a light on the ways in which purported attempts to make us secure and resilient end up having the opposite effect by making insecurity the default state of life in the 21st century. This afternoon's plenary speakers will each take up the complex interdependence of security and insecurity. Subsequent plenary speakers and breakout panels will take up insecurity from a variety of different methodological, theoretical, and disciplinary points of view. I know that I look forward to thinking with all of you about insecurity for the next couple of days, and especially to our plenary wrap-up panel, where we can all try to draw some lessons or find some patterns of thought from our collective work. Thanks very much. Now I'd like to welcome my colleague Kennan Ferguson up to introduce our first plenary speaker.
Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you not only the work but the person of Mark Neocleous. No one evidently can pronounce his name exactly the way that he pronounces it, so he assured me that my efforts would be adequate. Is that better? Mark is the author of a great many books, for somewhere around 10, and quite a few essays, many of which showed up in his books and others of which didn't. A few of his books, just to give you an idea of some of the range of his work, include Administering Civil Society Toward a Theory of State Power, The Fabrication of Social Order, a Critical Theory of Police Power, Imagining the State, Critique of Security, Anti-Security, War Power, Police Power, and The Universal Adversary, Security, Capital, and the Enemies of All Mankind. I expect many people here are familiar with some, at least, of these works. He's also written a number of essays that show that his reach goes even further than that. He's written on tetralogy, teratology, the relationship of, say, Marx to vampires or Burke to the monstrous. He's written about emergency power, about the role that masculinity and femininity play in international relations. And as Richard referenced, he's even written about resilience. Like Richard, he doesn't like it very much. I'd like to take a moment to read from Critique of Security, a brief passage in which Mark speaks very pertinently to the emergence of what we might consider a form of fascism that both Europe and the United States have seen in the past few years. He says, the attempt to secure the imagined community of a nation goes hand in hand with the politics of loyalty in reinforcing a system of symbolic representation and concrete difference from the other, the extensive policing of organizations and associations, and the political administration of human subjectivity. Alongside and as part of the national security state, we find a security, identity, loyalty complex held together by fear and violence. Deployed in the name of security, loyalty, and identity, help organize the political imagination around the state. Identity is mobilized for loyalty to the state. Loyalty is mobilized for identity with the nation. And both loyalty and identity are thereby mobilized for security. I mean to mislead you a little. He didn't write this in 2016 or 2015. He wrote this in 2008, or it was published in 2008. It was probably written a few years before that. And I mention this ability that Mark has to understand not just the current condition, but the emergent condition, not to reference his abilities for prediction. I don't want to talk about him in the vein of Jules Verne or George Orwell, like what does he get right and what does he get wrong? But rather than to point out that he is, in political philosophy and international relations theory, one of our preeminent diagnosticians. That is, he sees under the surface of things the conditions that exist, often far in advance of those conditions emerging as effects of those preconditions. Through his work, Mark usually and often sees these emergent conditions of crisis, of the ways in which our societies fail to function, or for some people function all too well. He has served as an editor or as a member of an editorial collective, I think more literally, although people who sent their work to, say, radical philosophy 15 years ago knew who they were really sending it to. And he is here to enlighten us even further as to problems in our own time. So please join me in welcoming Mark Neocleous.
Okay, so first of all, let me thank the organisers for the invitation to come here and speak today, and for all the organisational skills that they've employed to get this together. And thanks, Kennan, for that very generous introduction. So my title for this talk seeks to bring together in as compact form as possible two concepts which dominate our world today, namely insecurity and security. Now, we know how closely they connect in the most banal common sense kind of way, which tells us that security is the problem is the solution to the problems that go by the name of insecurity. But how did that common sense come to dominate? What can we do about it? Because I think something does need to be done about it. Now, I have for some time been thinking about a comment that Marx makes in his early works, but never really develops, namely that security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society. And what I want to do here today is a number of things which overlap. The first is that I want to say a little bit about the conjunction of security and insecurity in the form of the security industry. I'm going to then explore what I'm calling the uneven but combined histories of both security and insecurity. And a kind of backdrop to this paper is a rhetorical question, which is, can we write the history of insecurity, or what would such a history look like if we could write it? And I partly want to do that to try and offer some historical grounding for this idea of a critique of security. And within that history, I'm going to move between thinking about insecurity as a kind of question of moral psychology and insecurity as a question of political power. And all told, all of that's going to mean that in a roundabout way, this paper is going to be about the two things from which we seem to be unable to escape, namely capitalism and death. We know full well the extent to which capital creates insecurities, and hence a demand for security. To this demand and desire, capital responds with all of its usual flair and creativity, which is to say that insecurity is highly productive for capital. But to be productive for capital, it must first be translated into the materiality of the commodity. And if Marx is right in saying that as soon as something emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness in such a way that gives the commodity a kind of mystical value, then commodities presented in security terms are at an added advantage because they appear to serve the satisfaction of what we are constantly told is a basic, sometimes the basic, human need. But as Marx points out, commodity production per se is far from obvious and trivial. So tracing the production of security commodities takes us to the heart of the process whereby security becomes inscribed in social relations, and that is the basis of the security industry. The term security industry here refers to the connection between security and the commodity form, but also to the rationalization, distribution, production, and consumption of security, and therefore, hence, also insecurity. Now, it's fairly obvious that the security industry has no interest in actually eradicating insecurity. Rather, its interest lies in making a profit and reinforcing the power of the industry itself. And to make a profit, the security industry must sell security. And to sell security, it has to play on our insecurities, generate further insecurities, and must pander to the idea that our insecurities are very real and must be dealt with in some way. So insecurity is thus constantly invoked to both kind of incite and justify the practices of the security industry, which in turn interpolates us as sovereign subjects, right? The customer is king, despite being insecure, but also as very fearful subjects. The customer is insecure, despite being king. So behind every cry of insecurity comes a double-sided message: security with the next security product, which is the message from capital; security with the next security measure, which is the message from the state. Yet, like most industries, the security industry must perpetually cheat us of what it promises, always defaulting on its promissory note. All that is confirmed is that the real target will never be reached. So insecurity never goes away, regardless of the proliferation of security. Now, much of what I'm suggesting here has been intensified with the development of neoliberalism. A great deal has been made, as you know, of neoliberalism's productive power, its ability to transform not just institutions, but also subjectivities, and in particular to create entrepreneurial and productive subjects. But this production of new subjectivities is also very much an orientation of the subject around the idea of insecurity, and hence, in a way, around the whole politics of security. So the kind of restless work that that we have to do in our calling as capitalist subjects is now compounded by the restless work in a calling to security itself, requiring us to perform entrepreneurial skills as kind of economic subjects, but also security skills as security subjects, right? So Homo economicus unites with Homo securitas, we might say. But then, of course, what that means is that Homo economicus and Homo securitas is also always already Homo insecuritas. Now, as is well known, under neoliberalism, we're meant to believe in the work that we're doing and to actively show that we believe in it, identifying with the organization and signing up to the company's mission, vision, and values, even when it's clear that the company doesn't give a fuck about us. Yet this poses a problem for capital and its bureaucracies, which constantly question the workers' desires. So Frederick Lorden has a nice example in his book, Willing Slaves of Capital. The employee subject swears that they have no other passion than the manufacture of yogurt, our company's business. But can we really believe them? And the answer has to be no, and so that desire must be constantly expressed, measured, and assessed, since it's always in danger of fading. It strikes me that a similar point might be made about the contemporary security state. The citizen subject swears that they have no other interest in the security of the social order, but can we really believe them? And again, the answer must be no, and so that desire must also be constantly expressed, measured, and assessed, since it's always in danger of fading. So we're all thus constantly expected to keep performing security, which is the very reason for all the actions we're now being trained to undertake as security-conscious neoliberal subjects, such as learning resilience or learning how to be prepared for emergency, and the whole project of responsibilization more generally, right? Being responsible for our own value as human capital, responsible for our own resilience, responsible for our own insecurity, responsible for our own debt, responsible for our own depression. Yes, me too. This performance as an expression of our belief in and our obedience to security follows Pascal's formula for belief in general, which is the one that's cited by Althusser. Kneel down, move your lips in prayer to the gods of security, and you will believe. You will come to believe that you do believe, and you will come to believe that you have knelt down to pray precisely because you believe. Submit yourself to the security ritual, because the security ritual provides the strongest proof of security and proves beyond doubt that there are insecurities and we are doing something about them. All of this poses a fundamental problem, namely that so long as we hold on to the idea that security is one of life's prime wants or needs or rights, so the more we get embroiled in the security industry. And so the more we come to speak the language that security wants us to speak. We start looking for new or different or human forms of security. We start talking about progressive security. We start talking about food security and health security. There appears to be no exit from the domination of security. No exit, that is, as long as we keep with the language of insecurity. No exit, that is, unless we set ourselves up against security. But who could be against security? And what could it possibly mean to be engaged in a critique of security? And does this somehow imply being for insecurity? There's a statement in the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, and it goes something like this. Chase after money and security, and your heart will never unclench. Now, we all know that that's absolutely true about money. But we also know, I think, that chasing security equally produces little more than a very clenched heart. On a personal level, we know that we have the frailties that come with living. We get hurt, sick, and old. We know that caring and loving is going to bring us grief. We know that people change and change us. We know that death beckons of both an individual kind and, of course, the universal heat death that we're all going to face sooner than we originally thought. Never mind, of course, the immeasurable insecurities to be had around money, work, and so on. And given that we know this, Does not the idea of insecurity begin to look a little more than a little bit problematical? Might not embracing security be liberating? That was a message produced by Alan Watts, the person who did a great deal to put Zen Buddhism to get intellectuals to think about Zen Buddhism in the West in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. And far more recently, Eve Ensler, a person who did a great deal to put the vagina on the intellectual agenda in the West with her book, The Vagina Monologues, but in another book by her called Insecure at Last. That it takes two such writers working outside of academia to talk in that way about insecurity might well be worth us contemplating, perhaps over a drink. But I want to try and unravel this a little bit further by tracing the very uneven and combined histories of security and insecurity. The English word security comes from the Latin securitas. This is a complex word derived from se, meaning without, and cura, meaning troubling or carefulness. And together they give us se cura, securitas, to be without care, to be untroubled. Now, as you can see, there's an immediate ambivalence here, in that securitas, as the removal of the cura, can be either beneficial or harmful. Now, the idea that it's beneficial is found in the Roman Republic and with the work of writers such as Cicero and Seneca. For them, the cura, that is cancelled in securitas, means that securitas itself becomes associated with the beate vita, right, the blessed life, and tranquillitas animi, a kind of peace of mind. Quotes Cicero, "How can anyone be in possession of desirable security who has a multitude of evils attending him?" So the peace of mind that is here called securitas, and Cicero was probably the person that invented the word, refers to an internal feeling of stability and peace. Now this beneficial aspect of securitas makes it a very personal thing, right? It's a question, if you like, of psychology rather than politics, and I'm going to make more of this connection as I go along. And this is quite remarkable given how deeply a political thinker Cicero is. And you can see this in the fact that Cicero distinguishes between securitas and salus, right? Salus being safety, right? And the slogan that Cicero makes famous, salus populi suprema lex. The safety of the people is the supreme law, not the security of the people, right? So securitas in this sense is a question of the self, whereas the question of the state is a question of the salus. Now, with the collapse of the Roman Republic, this distinction begins to break down. This distinction between salus as safety and securitas as a kind of personal peace of mind begins to break down. And securitas is gradually employed in a more public fashion. You get this a little bit with the work of Seneca, who starts to connect the idea of an inner peace with the idea of tranquility in public. And then, for example, in the 1st century AD, you get the development of the word securitas on coins under the rule of Nero, hinting at a kind of political or public dimension to securitas. Now, all of that might be taken to suggest that securitas as a personal idea and a political idea comes together with the Romans in the 1st century and stays with us, and that would be a very nice and even story. Unfortunately, it's not the story. It's not the story because the fact that securitas could imply the removal of careful attention meant that it could also be seen as something negative, as I said, connoting a freedom from concern and danger, and thus a state of carelessness. You get this with the rise of Christianity, where securitas remains a personal peace, right? A personal peace, but, and this is a huge but, for reasons that we'll see, it's a personal peace that comes through union with God. So for Augustine, security is a blessed state, but its blessedness points to the fact that security, and here we need to start qualifying the word and talk about true security, is only possible posthumously. Right? Augustine in the Confession says, there is no security except through God. And in the City of God, he's even more explicit, claiming that security, like peace, comes with eternal life. So what this meant was for the early Christians was that to claim security in this world is an insult to God. The book of the Thessalonians in the Bible has, when people say there is security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. I want to hold that quote in the back of your minds for a moment because I'm going to come back to it to see what Hobbes cite it in just a little while. Okay, so to think of oneself as secure in this world, that is, if you like, in our language, to think of having a freedom from insecurity, undermines the ideal of and a desire for real security, which comes only with the eternal peace of death. Hence, a figure such as Pope Gregory I, right, Gregory the Great in the 6th century, says that security is often the parent of negligence, adding that to keep security from generating carelessness, one must come into the service of God. The last of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, to use a more modern example, insists that we enter heaven through many tribulations, but not through security. Robert Burton, in The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in various versions between 1621 and 1651, suggests two pieces of advice for warding off melancholy. The first is rely on God's word, and the second is to reject perverse security. Now, all of this goes some way to explaining why it is that the early references to security in the Oxford English Dictionary are to a negative state or condition. Quote, our vainglory, our viciousness, avarice, idleness, security, from 1564. Quote again, they were drowned in sinful security, right? Sinful security again, right? That's 1575. Shakespeare in Macbeth has one of the witches declare that security is man's chiefest enemy. Right? Security here is a careless, dangerous, and in some cases, more often than not, a sinful confidence, a reflection that is captured in a whole range of other books of this period. Just to give you a few examples, Johann Habermas publishes initially in German and Latin, very quickly translated into English and going through several editions, a book called The Enemy of Security, meaning the security is the enemy, right? That was first published in 1579. William Est publishes a book called The Scourge of Security from 1609. John Downame publishes a book called Guide to Godliness in 1622, which has a section in, which is also published as a separate small pamphlet, called A Treatise on Carnal Security. Right? All of these books tell the same story. They talk about the carnal security, they talk about the lethargy of security, they talk about security sinfulness. For Downame, the author of that last book, the treatise on carnal security, Downame says, security is, quote, the mother and nurse of all wickedness. So throughout early Christianity then, securitas is largely a pejorative term, in that to regard oneself as secure or to search for security in this life is flawed to the point of being sinful. One might seem secure, but this would be a highly deceptive state, and it would generate a false sense of a security that is in fact undesirable. So in general then, securitas is not employed in the Christian West as a positive political concept in any sustained manner before the 14th century. I know this is going back a bit, and I'm going to explain this as I go along. So broadly speaking, what then happens is that the process of secularization, alongside the emergence of a slowly developing modern state and an increasingly commercial order, sees securitas start to develop more positive connotations. First, of an external sense of public safety, but also gradually and not without difficulty towards a kind of moral psychology concerning an inner subjective sense of composure. But where is insecurity? I want to pause here for a moment on a famous painting. I just want to make sure this works. Does that work? Okay, fine. I want to get to this creature, right? This creature will appear in these paintings, but she will only appear at the end of going through this, right? I'm going to talk just a little bit about Lorenzetti's frescoes, which are in Siena, in the public palace in Siena. These frescoes have been described as the most important political allegory of the 14th century. And I say that with trepidation because it means that some of you may well know far more about them than I do, and therefore you might embarrass me. And if you don't know them, then shame on you because they're the most important political allegory of the 14th century. Okay, so these frescoes were commissioned by the Council of the Nine, who were governing Siena from 1279. They're commissioned in the mid-1330s, as you can see, and they're produced 1337, 1339. And the Council of the Nine are kind of representative of a kind of merchant oligarchy, right? And these pictures dominate three walls. Does this work? Okay, fine. So the pictures dominate three walls, right? You can't actually make out the first and the third wall fully, but I'm going to come to those in just a moment, okay? They have been described as allegories of good government and bad government. Good government is going to be over here, bad government is going to be over there, and in the middle, you have this image between the two. This is, I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see most of this, right? This is the middle image, and in the middle of the oops, what happened there? Can I go back? Okay, so in the middle of the middle image, this is peace, okay? And peace, as you can see, is fairly relaxed, lounging back, looking at what we'll see in just a moment, what she's looking at. And if I can just break this picture down, on Peace's right-hand side, over here, is this creature, and down here we have a creature called Concord. On Peace's left-hand side, we have a whole range of other figures. We have magnanimity, we have justice, we have charity, we have all these good figures, right? The figure in the middle, this kingly figure, isn't actually a king, or isn't. There's a debate in the literature about whether he's a king. Siena is a republic, so some people have said he can't be a king, okay? All right, if we go to bad government, this is the first half of bad government, okay? I'm going to go to the town of bad government in just a moment on the right-hand side. The figure in the middle, you might not be able to see the word. This figure is Tyramides, right? So bad government is ruled by Tyramides. As you can see, at Tyramides' feet, we have justice. You probably can't make out the words here. This is justice. As you can see, justice is looking pretty sad for herself. She's tied hand and foot, obviously being controlled by Tyramides. There's a devilish black goat here. There's a man-beast here. So all the wrong figures. He's holding a dagger, not a usual emblem of kingly authority, right? And alongside him, we have fury. We have division, and we have this figure here on his shield is war, okay? So we have fury, division, and war. Now, the other side of this image is bad government. You can see Tyramides here, peace tied up, right? This is the city under bad government. This is, as you can see, not a lot happening. There's all sorts of bad things absent, such as there's no church. And also, the only thing that seems to be happening is this person being murdered, okay? So knife crime is not as recent as people are making out, okay? So this is bad government. If we go to good government, this, as you can see, is the whole wall of good government. You can only see that half of it in just a moment. Just to let you know, you can see people have actually written articles about climbing a stepladder to the level at which peace can see, and they've worked out that peace is looking directly at good government. So into like this whole image here, this whole wall here is literally the vision of peace. Huh? Yeah, clever, huh? Right, so this is good government, and this is the city wall down the middle, okay? Bear in mind, I want to get to the creature that was up on the slide at the beginning, and she is here now, okay? So she's coming into vision. Wait for it. Okay, she's coming into vision. So let's just go to see both sides. This is the flat. This is the creature I want to pick up on. This is the city wall. I'm just going to say a little bit about the city and then say a bit about the countryside. This is the city. As you can see, there's lots happening. I think I've got slightly better. No, I haven't. There's lots happening. There are people there's people working, most importantly. There's people shopping. there's people producing things, there are men chatting, having a drink, there are ladies dancing, there's one lady banging a tambourine. You can always tell a sign of a good city when you've got a tambourine banger. This is the wall here. So let me go to the second image. This is the countryside. As you can see, this is the city wall. And I'll just focus in a little bit so you can see, as you can see, posh lady going off to probably hunt with some servants and some dogs. You got people bringing their pigs back into town. You got people working the land. You've got a very fertile land, right? Because this land has been worked on, okay? So this is outside the city walls, but it's still part of the city. And the point here, just to go back, there she is, right? The point here is that this figure is the figure that oversees good government, and this is Securitas, okay? Securitas oversees the well-ordered city. Securitas is what means people can go about their business, can go to work, can play the tambourine. Okay. She's holding a sign. Oops, what happened there now? She is holding a sign with her right hand. Okay, there are various translations of this. Let every man go about without fear, and let every man sow while this lady rules the lands, for she has taken power from the guilty. Okay, so the message is fairly clear as an allegory, right? If you want good government, if you want a peaceful city, if you want people to be able to go out to work, then you need security. Now, note three things about this series of images, and in particular this one, right? Now, I'm going to make 3 points about this. The first two I will come back to and develop through the rest of the talk. The third one is just in parentheses for some of you. So the first thing is, insecurity does not exist here, okay? The frescoes had a series of opposites, good government and bad government, right? Concord and discord, peace and war, charity and avarice, yeah? Security, not insecurity, right? It's not insecurity that is being talked about here. What is talked about here is in the first line. Let every man go about without fear. Fear is the issue here. Second thing, note the last line. She has taken power from the guilty, right? She has taken power from the guilty because of what she is holding in her left hand, which is the gallows, with a man swinging from it, right? So people can go about their business sowing the land because she has punished the guilty. So in that sense, she has removed that fear. But, of course, there is another tale here, which is if there is to be any fear, then it is fear of Securitas, because she is holding the gallows, right? In other words, Securitas holds death in her hands. I'll return to those 2 points and make a bit more of them in just a moment. I just want to add, there's a third observation here. I know some of you are interested in police science, police history, the police power, right? What we have here is an image of a social order that is founded on what we might call an institutional imposition of security. And it's interesting that Siena at this point was more or less an experiment in policing. There's a number of different forces across Siena, 5, right? And they're not huge, but what it meant was that by the mid-1330s, there was one police officer, as we might call them now, per 145 inhabitants of the city. That is a number that far outweighs Florence at the same time, and it far outweighs any modern state. Okay, end of kind of parenthetical point. Let's get back to the main issue about death. Now, this image goes some way to capturing precisely what was happening to Securitas from the 14th century onwards. What Lorenzetti is offering is a conception of security as the foundation of civil order and public welfare. And it's a sign of the gradual secularization and politicization of Securitas with the onset of modernity, as well as a mechanism for managing personal fear. So what we're witnessing, I think, with allegories like this is the gradual placement of security at the heart of conceptions of state and social order. Now that, of course, is precisely what we learn when we do our kind of political theory 101, right? Political Theory 101, we learn that security comes to form the underpinning of sovereignty, and it does so because of the insecurity experienced by human beings, right? So the frequently quoted passages on the generation of the Leviathan in Hobbes's work usually describe it as a response to the insecurity of the state of nature and the insecurity we have from being other people, and therefore the generation of a security state. But there's a problem with that story. And it's a complex problem, which I want to unravel a little bit more before coming to a close. And it's a problem that is connected to three things. First, the fact that insecurity is not yet really in the picture, both literally and also generally. The second is that what is in the picture is fear. And the third is that death is also a central issue. And I'm going to say a little bit about those in the context of Hobbes, then Adam Smith. Hobbes, as you well know, is regarded as the philosopher of security par excellence. And actually, he does this incredibly well because he brings together security with salus, but also he adds new terms, such as the Greek, New Testament Greek asphalia, which refers to a kind of firmness or stability, which comes from wrestling, but was also sometimes used to describe a general civic stability. And so when Hobbes translates Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War in 1628, he makes a point of translating asphalia as security. So he's certainly keen on pushing this idea of security. But he doesn't have the concept of insecurity. As far as I can see, he doesn't use it at all. And it's not surprising because at this point, insecurity doesn't exist. The Oxford English Dictionary gives the first use of insecurity from 1646, and it's used in a book that no one's ever heard of, and it doesn't have any political connotation. So Hobbes could possibly have had it, but it's not there, right? But if he didn't say anything about insecurity, what he does say a lot about is the Latin metus, which for him is the opposite of securitas, and which is translated as fear, and which is one of Hobbes's favourite words, right? And especially metus mortis violentae, the fear of violent death. So a state lacking in security then is not so much a condition of insecurity, but rather a condition of what Hobbes calls a continual fear and danger of violent death, right? Again, this is Lorenzetti, right? So Hobbes essentially believes that people must recognize this fear of violent death and organize themselves accordingly. And this is why Leviathan has to be read not just for the kind of parts 1 and part 2, right? Part 1 being of man, part 2 being of commonwealth, where he outlines the state of nature and man's nature and the creation of the sovereign power offering and security and so forth. In other words, the parts that everyone reads. It also has to be read for what he says about security in the fourth part, the part that no one reads, which is more or less a political theology concerning what he calls the kingdom of darkness. And in that part, Hobbes imagines the apostles, after Jesus' resurrection, asking Jesus whether he will restore the kingdom to Israel. And Hobbes answers for Jesus, because he felt like he could do that, right? Hobbes answers for Jesus, to the effect that, quote, "It is not for you to know the times and seasons which the Father has in his power." And he then cites the Bible again, which is the passage from Thessalonians that I cited a few minutes ago, to the effect that when people say there is peace and security, then destruction will be upon them. Right? It's the kingdom of darkness, after all. So what is going on in part 4 of Hobbes's book is thus a suggestion that the security constructed through the Leviathan in the first parts of the book is in a sense not real security. Rather, real security is only achieved with or through another kingdom. And this is a kingdom restored by Christ at the end of time, at which point the Leviathan created in the first parts disappears. Now, what this means is that it's not really enough to say that for Hobbes, the sovereign is created in order to provide security out of a condition of insecurity. The picture is much more complicated because the security offered by the sovereign is a kind of holding power, which is a political strategy that arises from a moral psychology concerning the fear of death, not insecurity. Security itself only comes with the end of time, right? Messianic time, historical time, or just our own personal time. going to flesh that out a little bit with some comments on Adam Smith, and I'm doing that for a number of reasons. One, it's 100 years later. Two is Smith is generally regarded as a liberal thinker and kind of against Hobbes's authoritarianism. And the third is, of course, where I started. Neoliberalism likes to go back to Smith and claim Smith as a founding idea, classical liberal thinker. 100 years later, when Smith is writing, insecurity has still not become a commonplace term. In Smith's Wealth of Nations, insecurity does not appear. Insecure appears once, and then in relation to the relationship between the sovereign and the clergy, right? It's not insecure. It's not what we mean. In contrast, what does appear? Fear, fears, feared, fearing, lots of times. And one of the central fears for Smith is the fear of death, which is the very point he makes in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, Smith treats the fear of death as one of the most important principles of human nature. It's this fear of death that completes the opening chapter of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? So his first book, the first chapter of his first book, and he talks about the fear of death. And it's probably more important than the whole logic of sympathy for which the book is otherwise known. Why is it important? 3 steps through this. This fear begins with sympathy for the dead, which is a core feature of Smith's general argument about sympathy. Our sympathy for the dead forms the basis of all other sympathy. We sympathize even with the dead, he says, and we're affected by that awful futurity which awaits them, being deprived of the light of the sun and human conversation and prey to decay and insects. Why? Because, he says, it generates a foresight of our own dissolution so terrible to us. At the same time, however, and second, the lack of the sun, the lack of conversation, the decay and so forth, does not affect the, note the word, happiness of the dead. That's Smith's word, right? Why? Because of what he calls the, quote, the profound security of their repose. So death, he says, is a safe harbor. And we differentiate our own lack of security, or what we might say insecurity, with the security of the dead. Third, this fear of death propels people into new forms of security. Death, Smith says, is the king of the terrors, in one of his very Hobbesian moments. Both sides of this psychology push us into the hands of a power which might then appear to offer us security, which is, of course, the sovereign power. So the fear of death ends up being what he calls the great restraint upon injustice, which, while it might mortify the individual, it guards and protects society. So Smith is here on the terrain of security as, if you like, a moral psychology and a political strategy organized around the fear surrounding death. So the same theme runs through the work of these thinkers who, as you can probably guess, I'm treating as, if you like, exemplary thinkers on the nature of the bourgeois order. The key for them was to point to the need for something that might act as the political condition of security, and which might do so because of our fear of death, while also pointing to the fact that anything we might call real security is possible only in death. All of this is a kind of historico-theological backdrop to the political problem we face in thinking about securities insecurities. Because these visions of politics think of both the public and the private sides of security, but also simultaneously the impossibility of security other than with death, and hence hark back very much to the Christian tradition. Hence security is still in some sense divine, but it's divine only by virtue of being a feeling achieved with the divine. And in the meantime, all that we have is the security offered by a sovereign power which plays on the concept that will later become known as insecurity, but which these writers are far more categorical about, which is the fear of death. Now, all of that leaves us in a bind. Why? A number of final thoughts here, taking us back to the security industry. First, The peace and security of being in the arms of God was no doubt once highly reassuring, but we are rather unfortunate in having killed God. So this liberation from the mythology of security has reinforced our belief in the state and then the security industry, which likes to reassure us that it can perform the task of God, all the while knowing that we know that such a task is impossible. A problem which is then in turn compounded by the fact that the one thing that the modern state can and does guarantee is the perpetual insecurity of the capitalist order. Second, perhaps all of this tells us that the worst of the security industry's power is that it dispossesses us of our own death. To the extent that it wants to take our future away from us, it obliterates all other visions of the future. Perhaps security is some kind of pact devised in opposition to death, which is precisely why it has come to stand as the basis of sovereignty. And those of you who like your theory with a French accent will detect the voice of Jean Baudrillard in some of these comments. The whole question of death gets buried beneath the banal and seemingly never-ending performance of security and its insecurities. This is why every discussion about insecurity and security, and including, I'm predicting, our discussions over the next 2 days, are always tinged with a sense of melancholy, right? A reminder not of what we cannot have, but of what we have lost. And this truth is perhaps made clearer still given a third thought, which is that if there is one thing that might be said about the security industry, is that it is a death machine. It is a system for the manufacture of corpses. And this melancholy, therefore, gets even greater and greater as we watch on TV the piles of dead bodies created by the security industry, which is essentially the modern equivalent of Securitas holding the gallows, right? I'm security, I can do this, right? And yet, surviving and thriving through the manufacture of death, the security has an easy time insisting that what it is doing is responding to our insecurities by manufacturing security. So if you like, death gets sublimated within security. And with that in mind, let me come to a close and give you a chance to either clap or chuck some veg. And I want to say a few words about abolition. Because the position which sets itself up as anti-security, and hence, if you like, wants to avoid making insecurity a central idea, is in effect an abolitionist politics. Now, abolitionist politics is now closely associated with the prison. And the key question underpinning prison abolition, which is the question asked by Angela Davis and others, which is, how is it that so many people end up in prison in the first place, is also a question that really is the question we should be asking about the police power, right? How is it that so many people end up as an object of the police power? And it seems to me that the question, can we imagine the end of prisons, aligns with the question, can we imagine the end of police? And what I want to suggest is that both of these questions are part of actually a more challenging question, namely, why not the abolition of the security industry, and hence with it, the politics of security? And this is a question that a lot of abolitionists actually shirk from, I think. And what they tend to fall back on is the idea that we can reconceptualize security. We can think of more progressive forms of security. In my view, I don't think we can even begin to think about prison abolition without considering the role of the security industry in getting people into prison in the first place. So the kind of anti-security position I'm articulating here thus seeks to enlarge the scope of abolitionism to the abolition of a politics organized in any way whatsoever around security, which means stop treating security and insecurity as opposites, because that's what plays into the hands of the security industry, but also stop using insecurity as a measure of what we're fighting against. This might mean embracing insecurity and giving up security. Not just prison abolition then, not just police abolition, but security abolition. Down with Homo securitas and the security industry that produces this creature, but perhaps also down with the logic of insecurity on which the industry thrives. Thanks very much for listening. what happens now? Oh, okay. Do I have to stay here?
You want to do your own stuff? You want to call him?
Oh, I don't mind. Well, okay. I'm chairing my own Q&A. That's so thank you for your questions. Now I'm going to the bar. Is there any questions? One and then.
Sorry, me?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was really rewarding and super interesting. And I can't wait to talk about this over drinks. I had more of like a note, which is the way that you described abolitionist work didn't sound familiar to me, right? Insofar as I would think that sort of the pivoting towards a term like justice and accountability, community accountability models and the like is actually very much a way about embracing, in essence, the inevitability of the harm that we do to each other within a community and finding different ways of kind of working that through. So it's more of like a note because, there's lots of other things I'd love to engage with, but I'm kind of more looking forward to talking about that over the next couple of days. But I just did think that didn't sound like a fair characterization of what abolitionist discourse looks like around the question of security, safety, and the like.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, you're absolutely right. I wasn't trying to characterize it in that sense, and I'm well aware of the other concepts that are generated and pursued. What I do think is buried away in some of those texts is precisely an assumption about security being able to be recaptured and reconsidered and reconceptualized. And I was partly just driven by this is exactly a comment that Angela Davis makes in Prison Abolition, the Prison Abolition book. And it's in passing, right? It's not what I'm doing now is making a point about security. It's in passing, it's embedded in the text, right? Where she starts talking about what we need is a progressive notion of security. And in a sense, I think that's makes it even more interesting, the fact that it's not presented as this is the key idea in the way that other key ideas are presented. It's embedded in the text. And I think that's part of the problem that so many meant to encourage us to think that we know what they mean, but we don't always. And melancholy isn't one of those terms, right? Apart from a few left melancholy theorists, people don't use that term very much now, right? Not even in psychoanalysis, really, yeah? And I think that is part of its attraction for me, which is why I hesitate around things like anxiety, for example. So it wasn't an answer to your question, it was just an open admission of something clearly at fault in my character. Any more? There was some more. There's one. So who's got the mic? Yeah.
I've just been tapped, so I think it's my turn. So I'm really interested in this notion of the abolition of security and kind of what that might look like in practice. So I find myself wondering as I'm staring at this, like if we were to paint like collectively the fresco in which the abolition of of the world in which security has been abolished, what does that? I'm just wondering what that looks like in practice, or how you envision. How you envision such a place or such an arrangement, given that this logic of security has become so embedded in all of the domains you talked about, in economics and politics and in culture. So I'm really curious how that might play out in practice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fortunately, I can't paint, so I won't be producing any frescoes with a vision of good government on it. If you mean what would it look like in practice in terms of what might a future society look like that didn't have that concept at its heart, then I've got no idea, and it doesn't bother me very much. If you want to kind of bring that back a bit, and if this could be an answer to a question about practice, I guess the point is perhaps, what we could just start with not organizing politics around security. Now, the very minimum or the very basis of that would be a rejection of all of the ex-security politics that's now emerging. It's you, right? You got it. I looked around for a red face, and there you were. So what's happened with this proliferation, this expansion of the security industry, is there's a whole set of debates around, for example, food security or health security, and I don't think that they're very helpful. We have a long history of very powerful words to describe what it is that we might want to achieve, right? In practice, your question, right? If it's hunger we're talking about, then hunger explains a lot to me. I understand what hunger is. I don't understand what food security is. And I worry that attached to food security is a whole set of other politics that isn't about satisfying a very basic human need of eating, right? It's about something else. It's about playing the role within the security framework. And so, yeah, and the same with health security. I don't know what that means, right? I think I understand, basic healthcare needs. We can talk about those things, right? We can talk about satisfying human needs without using the language of security. So if your question is about practice in terms of some future formation, I've got no idea what that might look like, right? My life's difficult enough without trying to think of those things, right? But if we're talking about kind of immediate campaigns that we might engage in, then I think we can do that without the category security. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And I guess the follow-up question that maybe doesn't even need an answer is if you're sort of thinking about how security and insecurity are not quite the opposites that we imagine them to be, but rather are intertwined, then what would be the opposite of security, right? If not insecurity, like in this, if we're sort of thinking about the abolition of security, then what would be a more productive framework?
Solidarity.
Solidarity. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, it's me. I'm chairing, aren't I? We had a question. Who's got the mic? You two. Who's got one of the mics?
Thanks. I want to ask something about the concept of order. I know it's very much central to your work. So in this picture of this fabricated dichotomy between security and insecurity, where does the concept order stand? And here, does insecurity refer to disorderliness? And in that sense, is it related with bad government? And finally, what can you say about the relation between order and that?
Okay, that's a good series of questions. So I guess in terms of order, I'm trying to think here about the way in which insecurity and security play off of each other, incite each other, provoke each other, are used to support each other and sustain each other. And in that sense, how the contemporary order is framed around and through these ideas. I've forgotten the second question.
Relation between order and that.
That was the third question.
Okay, I asked if, here does insecurity refer to a kind of disorderliness in the sense that it is about bad government?
No, okay.
Bad government here, disorderliness.
Well, look, when you hear the cry from politicians or police officers about disorder or disorderliness, it is almost always associated with the idea that there is some insecurity at place, which is why precisely they have to step in and restore order, right? So with security comes order, with order comes security, right? These things go hand in hand, right? So the point is to use the insecurity is used to justify the security mechanisms which then fabricate and sustain the order.
Well, here, bad government is like this problem. It implies that the problem originates from the poor governing practices.
Ah, right, okay. Yeah, because, well, in terms of these images,
Yes.
yeah, no, but they do, right? Because they're poor governing practices precisely because you have the wrong values, the wrong virtues, well, not virtues, right? You have the vices in power, yeah? So what you have dominating the city is tyranny, and tyranny's close allies of fury and discord and war and avarice and so forth, yeah? And when you have those values governing the city, then you end up with a condition in which either nothing happens or the things that do happen are bad things, yeah? So those images, so the bad government here, right? What's interesting about this is partly some of it is just blanked out, right? It's nothing. Like you wanted to just paint sort of nothing happening, yeah? And then the things that are happening is these characters on the far left, as you look at it, seem to be going off to war, right? And then in the bottom of the city in the right hand corner is someone being killed, right? So that's what happens when you have the vices in power. That's what happens when you have the absence of all the virtues, like peace, security. Third question was about security and death. Order and death. What's going on behind your question?
Well, here in this presentation, you are linking that with final realization of security, right? At last, kind of.
Actually, I said sublimation, but
Yes. So, can we here establish a relation with, that finally putting everything in its place in an orderly way?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it does play on a number of things, which I haven't fully worked through. I think partly some of this material plays on things that we know, right? Which is about peace at last, eternal peace, and so forth. Yeah, in one iteration of this, I had a reference to, or I had a little discussion planned of Kant's perpetual peace, right, which is interesting because it does more or less the same thing that Hobbes and Smith are doing with security. He does with peace, right? So the joke at the beginning of the perpetual peace essay is, if you want perpetual peace, you go to the graveyard, right? That's the sign. Yeah? Perpetual peace is in the graveyard because that's where we find peace. I think a lot of this plays on certain cultural norms that we have about respect for the dead, about respecting dead bodies, in all sorts of ways that I haven't really thought through. There was one. Yeah.
This is following up on some of the comments on abolition, and I think that you and abolitionists are more in line than you're giving.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, I'm not trying to.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, because
No, I should say I'm trying to say that.
Okay.
But I'm also trying to say they should be more in line with me. But anyway, go on.
well, okay, so let me put it. Then I actually think abolitionist thinkers and philosophers are actually more in line with what you're thinking. In terms of your argument is saying that we shouldn't organize our politics around security. That's exactly what they're doing, and I think that so like the first clapback to abolition. abolitionist thinking is like, what about the rapists and the murderers? What are you going to do? Like, how are we going to have an orderly society with them? That is a question about a fear of violent death for some of us. But the answer, the non-abolitionist answer to that question is predicated on the premature death of everybody who's subjected to policing power and prisons, right? And so abolitionist response to that is like, you're focusing on the wrong question about your own fear of violent death. And you have to think about, how do we rebuild a society from the ground up in which people don't have that, where those fears of violent death are mitigated, because everyone has access to the resources for a livable life. And this goes back to the opening comments about like, you know, like we don't have access to food and shelter and water and whatever, right? And so, I think that your initial comments about abolition were focusing more on the kind of negative parts of abolition, which is like getting rid of policing and prisons, and less focused on the positive investment parts of abolition, which is about re-envisioning what our society should look like. And this gets back to your question, like, right? So like, what is the goal? Like, what would that look like? And abolitionist thinkers have said, this is not some pie in the sky, like, you know, futuristic, you know, science fiction or stuff. It's already happening right here. It's just not accessible to most of us. If you go to affluent, you know, communities, they have full employment. They pay like higher rates of taxes on their properties so that their kids can go to well-funded schools that have all the resources that they need. They have public parks. They have community gardens. They have all the things that they need to have a livable life. And the question is, why only for them and not for everyone? And so I think that is like more of the question, but the vision is already there and it's already present right now. So anyways, this is not really a comment. This is just more that I think abolitionists are like actually kind of thinking through and like, this question of how do we build a society that's not based on security insecurity?
Okay, I'll take that. Yeah, okay. I'll consider it. I wasn't.
Okay, read Miriam Kava.
I dread to think that you thought I was trying to criticize them. I wasn't doing that. I was much more saying I think that, you know, there is a tendency to sometimes slip into a certain kind of set of assumptions about what might or might not be achieved with security. But you know,
Okay.
I'll happily consider further.
So we should probably give you a break in a few moments.
Yeah.
But I wanted to
Or
ask.
now? Now's good.
You don't want. I wanted to ask you about the picture of security, and nobody's really commented, but I presume have thought about the fact that security is this partially nude angel, a young woman with a kind of boyish figure. And I'm curious about security being pictured in that way. And the translation also, if you go back to that, you know, sort of, well, let every man go about without fear, let every man sow while this lady rules the land. So there's a way in which there's a kind of, I think, implicit critique of patriarchy there, iconographically anyway, and a suggestion that if we had that, well, that security and sort of securitization, which doesn't exist then, is in a certain sense the product of male rule. And anyway, I just wanted to note what I'm sure, as I said, many people must have been thinking about, the fact of the sort of feminization of that figure, as well as the kind of nakedness of that figure. I guess angels of sorts, if that's an angel, don't wear clothes. But just the suggestion of a kind of alternative formation of rule. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say about just thinking about that and about security being placed that way was to put that in relation to what you had said about the Christian notion of security as something that's dangerous, that it's when you feel that you're secure, that you are in fact deceived, because true security only comes through Christ and after death. And you know, whether there's not also perhaps some suggestion there that this security figure is also a deceptive figure and not strictly a positive one. and that deception connected with her as being a desirable female or something like that. I don't know. I was just surprised, I guess, that we haven't talked about it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I was trying to get at the ambivalence with the question of fear and the idea that she's protecting, but also reminding people of the power that she holds. I mean, I think if I'm just going to go back here, it would be difficult to do, I think, fully, but it may well be. I'm just thinking about how many figures of good government are female apart from the ruling male. No, there are more men. There are more men down there. No, it won't work. But yeah, no, it's an interesting thought. It's not something I've seen a great deal of in the literature on this, but the literature on this is huge.
Okay, one last question and then we'll take a break.
It's like a Mary Douglas purity and danger figure, right? That innocent feminine body, that particular presentation of that particular presentation of the female nude, right, who is also not naked, right, are historically signals, right, as a figure of a kind of innocence, and she's holding the guilty in her hand, right? So, so far as like that dynamic around sexuality, purity, danger, innocence, guilt, all that is allegorized, right, in her figure. Right? So I would say she has to be female for that reason, so, yeah.
She has to be female because she encapsulates both purity and danger. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's
that's
a
interesting.
long and rich tradition of of sexual vulnerability, right? The imaging of a kind of sexual innocence, but also vulnerability and potential for corruption gets carried by the female body, but quite specifically. Yeah. Right. So, just needed to say that because it's kind of a basic in feminist studies, right? But not always, never, not commonly held body of literature, I think so. And I'm going to say, I think I was partly responding to something like that, because like some of the terms that you're describing describe the reparative turn that, in the study in affect theory, as we call it, in queer theory, that there's been a strong critique of a paranoid model, which is kind of articulated around a drive towards a perfect sense of security as if it were achievable, as actually toxic and damaging and death-driven. Right? Just to say that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that. Yeah. I'm allowed to stop. Yeah. Okay.
We'll convene back about 20 minutes.